Chapter 4, the title is American Life in the 17th Century. 17th century, important that you know and understand, really is the 1600s. So we know that the Jamestown settlers landed in 1607. So we're going to be talking about what it was like between 1607 all the way up to 1699, around the year 1700. So life was different in the north and the south and the middle colonies. It was completely different than it was later on. So these are the early years of what life was like in America when it was settled by the English, along with a bunch of other people too, not just the English. So let's talk about how unhealthy the Chesapeake was. We've been talking about this quite a bit, how dangerous life was, difficult life was in the southern colonies. So the Chesapeake is, it involves the colonies of Virginia, Maryland, North and South Carolina, as well as Georgia. So you know that there are a lot of mosquitoes down there in certain places like Jamestown. The weather is hot and it's humid, and disease was ran very rampant in the South. Malaria, typhoid, and dysentery. Malaria, we know about that. Yellow fever. The Jamestown settlers suffered from that. The Europeans coming over had they had no resistance to that disease. People who had lived there a long time, were able to be resistant to malaria because of Darwin's survival of the fittest. Only the ones who were healthy enough to pass on their DNA were the ones who were resistant. If you weren't resistant to malaria, you'd probably die before you had kids. And that's how a community becomes immune to a disease like malaria. Well, the Europeans coming over didn't have that resistance to malaria, so they died in alarming numbers. We know about that from Jamestown. Typhoid, and dysentery caused by the water being polluted, not so much pollution, but just has microorganisms in it that are able to grow over time. You never have those really cold winters that would kill off a lot of the microbes in the water. So dysentery, typhoid were diseases caused by bad water. So the thing about that is, it's kind of gross, but you get uncontrolled diarrhea and people die from that. It's one of the leading causes of death in the world today, not necessarily in the United States, but it's one of the leading causes of death in the world. But the reason it kills people is because of dehydration. You eventually have so much diarrhea that it dehydrates your body. It sucks all the water out. So what you do to help with that would be drink more water. And there's other medications, obviously, that are involved. But when you're thirsty, you drink more water. And what they didn't know, what they didn't understand during this time was that you're drinking the water that's killing you. You need more water because of the uncontrolled diarrhea. You continue to drink it and it gives you worse diarrhea and you eventually die. So that happened quite a bit. The life expectancy, if you lived in the Chesapeake, very low. You didn't live for very long. Few people lived to be 40 or 50 years old. And interestingly enough, family values were non-existent due to one-parent families, or in many cases, no-parent families. Kids just running around with no moms, no dads, no grandparents. Grandparents were non-existent in the South during the 1600s because you didn't live that long. So morals were low. Normally, you pass down your morals from generation to generation. Your parents teach you about what's wrong and what's right. Your grandparents teach you what's wrong and what's right, but if they're not around, nobody knew. So evidence of that, a third of all brides in one Maryland county already pregnant before their wedding. So they weren't told maybe even why or how they got pregnant, and the morals weren't there as well. So it was a difficult place to exist in the South. And many of those kids that were born died early because of those diseases that we've been talking about. I think you know and understand, because we've been talking about it, how important tobacco was to the Southern economy. It was everything. It's what allowed that lucrative trade to go to exist between the mother country, England, and its colonies. The colonies would provide the tobacco. The ships would come and they'd travel by way of the slow-moving navigable rivers like the James River in the south. And they would go to plantations and they'd trade English goods for tobacco. And that lucrative trade would go on. And there was close ties between the mother country, England, and its colonies. Most of the work done on these plantations was done by indentured servants. We talked about the headright system from the previous chapter, where if you paid the passage of one person, you got a large chunk of land that you could plant more tobacco, so you could make more money, and then you could pay for more indentured servants to come over, and that's how things went in the South. But eventually, this whole system's going to fall apart because indentured servants would work their contracts and not receive any land or any money. And they didn't have money enough to be able to purchase land because land was too expensive. So they became squatters. Many of them moved down, as we looked at in the last chapter, to North Carolina, squatters colony. But many of them just simply moved west. And by moving west, that may be 2, 3, 4 miles west of the East Coast. And they would be in large groups, and they were troublesome at times. They'd be attacked by Indians. They'd steal from Native Americans. They'd steal from the plantations that they used to work for. So it became a big problem that was going to have to be addressed, and especially when it all came to a head with Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion, Bacon was a former indentured servant who led a band of former indentured servants against the colony. And against Jamestown. They were going to go riot in Williamsburg, which is the capital of Jamestown. They were frustrated out west. They had no jobs. They had no money. They had no land. They had no women, because it was mostly dudes that were indentured servants. So they were a band of people that just wandered and wandered. And they were upset because Native Americans were attacking them. So what they did is they appealed to Governor Berkeley, governor of Virginia, and said, "Hey, can you send the militia to help us?" And of course, Governor Berkeley didn't want to send the militia to upset the Indians. The Indians, they were trying to trade with them and not trying to fight against them. And he didn't feel like that it would be worthwhile to send them out there. And frankly, he didn't care very much about the indentured servants. So Nathaniel Bacon got all of his men together in 1676 and decided that they were going to attack Williamsburg near Jamestown, just to get their point across. And they started doing that. And once they started, Bacon got really sick, came down with malaria, and died. And then the whole thing fell apart. All the rest of the rebellious former indentured servants went back out west. When Governor Berkeley then decided that he was going to go out and round up as many of Bacon's followers as he could to prove a point and to punish them, to make sure that this didn't happen again. And he rounded up 23 of his Bacon's followers, and he hanged them with no trial by jury. And that was a violation of English law. English law did travel across the Atlantic Ocean. The colonists were protected by English law. Incidentally, Berkeley was captured by the British authorities, and he was brought back to England, and he was put on trial, found guilty, spent the rest of his life in jail for doing what he did to Bacon's followers. Now, Bacon's Rebellion, as interesting as it is, the real reason that we talk about it is because it marked the end of the indentured servant as a labor source. The colonists began to realize that wasn't working. So obviously we know that in 1700, they turned to African slaves as their source of labor. So it went from one free labor source to another free labor source, but that's happening in the 1700s. This chapter mostly is talking about what's happening in the 1600s, But just so you know, Bacon's Rebellion was really what helped bring that about even faster. So there's a sketch of Bacon's Rebellion, 1676. They're there at Jamestown. So next up, colonial slavery is going to happen. So interesting stat here, in the 300 years following Columbus's discovery of America, only about 400,000 of the total 10 million African slaves were brought over to where present day United States is. What that means is the majority of slaves that came over, the majority of the 10 million slaves that came over found themselves going to Latin American countries, to Central America and South America. Not as many went up to the present day United States. However, the number of slaves in present day United States shot up because slaves had kids and they just multiplied that way. So that doesn't mean to say that we didn't have that many slaves in the United States, because the United States did have a lot of slaves. The Middle Passage is the route that slaves took from Africa to America, and it was brutal, absolutely horrific. Slaves were put in ships, and they were, usually put down in the hold down below the ship with very little light, very little air, very little food. And it was common for half the cargo of slaves to die on the way over. And what they would do is they'd simply throw the bodies overboard. In history, generally speaking, slaves were a manageable group because of fear tactics. If slaves were threatening to rebel, they'd kill slaves to prove their point. The owners would, and slaves would generally fall in line because of all these fear tactics that happen. So the arrows here in this map represent the route over across the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage would be the Atlantic Ocean there, and you could see the thick lines that are going over to South American countries, and then the thinner lines, arrows that are going up to present day United States. But this is the route that they took. Now, how did they get the slaves from Africa? Well, there were rich African tribes that lived along the west coast of Africa, and they would go into the interior of Africa. They'd fight wars, and they'd go in there specifically looking for prisoners of war. And then they'd take them to the coast, where they'd put them in cages, and they would wait for these ships to come over. And the ships would come over from places like New England states. Also, some European countries got involved in it too, as we'll talk about later on. These ships would come to the west coast of Africa, and they'd trade things like weapons and alcohol and cloth and clothing, things like that, to the African tribes, where they would get the slaves. They'd put them on the ship, and they'd go across the Middle Passage. So something that we'll talk about in a couple chapters from now would be triangular trade, and that's what's happening here. So here's a couple sketches of what it was like on board. The sketch on the left here shows slaves up top. Every once in a while, they would let them get air, go up to the top. But generally speaking, is more common to have what's on the right here is this is like the top cut off of a ship, so you could see down below. And they were lining slaves up one after the other with buckets to go to the bathroom, and that were overflowing. And these slaves would get sick, typhoid, and die. And then, like I said, they would throw them overboard. So horrific journey that slaves had to take. Many of these slaves would get seasick on the way. So you can imagine how dirty and smelly it was in these ships down in the hold. Meanwhile, in the South, tobacco thrived. It says here, the more tobacco Virginia had growing, the more slaves they needed. As a result, more and more slaves were brought over to the South. There developed a definite hierarchy in the South, the way things were in the South at the time. You had at the very top would be the Virginia aristocracy. The FFAs, sometimes they were called the First Families of Virginia, FFVs, had many slaves, huge plantations, and it was marked by close contact with England. as we said, the trade that happened back and forth. They had all the money, all the power. They called all the shots in the South, the plantation owners. And then underneath that, you had the small farmer, who's probably the largest of the social groups, maybe had one slave or two, or most of them had no slaves. There are small farmers that didn't own huge plantations. And then underneath that, you had landless whites, also known as indentured servants. And then under that, you had the slaves and indentured servants. So that's not necessarily numbers wise, because the largest of the group was the small farmers, but that's kind of the way the power structure was in the South. And remember, when we're talking about the South, we're talking about Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Now, on the flip side, you had the New England colonies. The New England colonies consisted of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire. And life couldn't be more different here. It was marked in the New England colonies by clean air, cold winters that killed any microbes in the water. There were large families. In the South, you had mostly men. In New England, you had families. Whole families came over. We talked about the Puritans, examples of, families coming over. They're settling for religious reasons. They're not necessarily settling for financial reasons. They're not looking to climb the ladder of success, most of the settlers that came to New England, because you really weren't. It was more difficult to become rich in New England. It was easier in places like Virginia and even the middle colonies because of the farms. If you came to New England, you're probably coming because you wanted to worship as you pleased. So once again, large families, kids sometimes, many kids, 10, 15, even more. Moral values were high because grandparents were around. You expected to live to be about mid-60s to 70 years old, not that far off from today's is around 80, and got up into there's plenty of people around in New England that were in their 80s. Not as many as today, but you had a pretty long life expectancy there. Grandparents were common, so they passed down those morals. Women didn't have much say in what went on. We know about the widowarchy in the South, but in New England, it wasn't common for men to die young. So they usually would have a male heir that would take over their property. So women didn't have as much power in the North, interestingly enough. Education was important. We discussed the Puritan model of education in the previous chapters. The Puritans believed it was important that kids learn to read so they could read the Bible. And even starting colleges. We'll talk about Harvard being started here in America, or shortly after the Puritans landed. Democracy will become important. In the beginning, that the church leaders feared democracy. They didn't want the masses of the people to have much power or much say at what went on. They wanted to call all the shots. But over time, democracy does develop. They had town meetings where they would voice vote, a pure democracy. They would count the people's vote by their voice. You'd stand up and you'd vote for somebody. If it was for the mayor, everybody would get around the town square and they'd vote one by one. So it was a model of democracy. In fact, it was Thomas Jefferson who said the best model of democracy he had ever seen was a New England town meeting. So, high praise for the democracy in the New England colonies eventually. We know that took time for that to happen. So we talked about the Puritan model education and the Puritan work ethic, which was strong. Work for 6 days a week. On the seventh day, you rest. So, covered bridge there, maybe look something like this, New England. What's a little bit off in this picture, because it's of the time of year, it's obviously the fall. You could see the changing of the colors of the leaves. Most of the rivers were fast-moving rivers that were non-navigable by ship. So no contact with England. There's Harvard right there. I talked about it. It was started in 1636, a mere 6 years after the Jamestown settlers landed in Boston. And they thought it was important that they had a place to train Puritan preachers. And that's why Harvard was started, to train Puritan preachers. Obviously, it's gone beyond that. But life in these New England towns was very organized. They specialized. They had their builders, they had their hunters, they had their teachers, they had their professors. Towns usually had a meeting house surrounded by a house and a village green where they would vote. Towns of more than 50 families were required to have primary education. Towns of more than 100 had to provide secondary education. Back then, secondary education would be the equivalent of like middle school today. Once you got past 12 years old you weren't going to school unless you were going to become a preacher. And then at 12 or 13 years old, you would go to Harvard and you'd learn to be a preacher. So that was happening during this time. There's a picture of a one-room schoolhouse. But obviously that's not from the time period, because Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, you see their pictures in the distance there. They weren't around. They weren't born yet at this point.